The
She's
morning
watching
sun
you. Don't
filtered
move.
through the chain-link
What, a dog?
fence surrounding the
That's
auto
right.
shop
Now get in the
Riverside
car.
City,
No way, man.
casting
Get away.
long
You had your
shadows
chance.
across the
Move.
cracked
I
concrete
ain't going.
where Marcus Webb stood with his German Shepherd Dakota. The dog's name was embroidered on her collar, but only Webb knew the real story. How she'd been rescued from an abusive police handler years ago, traumatized and broken until Webb gave her a second life where she could protect instead of fear. Dakota was 7 years old now, her black and tan coat brushed to a shine, her dark eyes scanning the industrial district with the vigilance of someone who'd learned early that danger always came without warning. She pressed her nose against Webb's left leg as they walked toward the shop entrance, a routine they'd perfected over 18 months of undercover work. Marcus Webb was 41 years old with deep brown skin, short salt and pepper hair, and hands calloused from 12 years of federal undercover operations. He'd worked cartel cases in Miami, dismantled organized crime networks in Chicago, and now he was in Riverside City playing the role of Arthur Pendleton, a maintenance worker with a rescue dog and no criminal record. The role was perfect. Nobody paid attention to quiet men with rescue dogs. The wire hidden beneath his shirt was the size of a matchbox taped to his ribs, transmitting everything to the FBI field office 7 miles away where Special Agent in Charge Robert Kingsley was listening. But what the FBI's equipment couldn't detect was what Dakota could sense: the tension in Webb's movements, the slight elevation in his heart rate, the small tremor in his fingertips as he unlocked the shop door. Dakota had learned to read these signals over 2 years of partnership. She didn't trust the police uniforms that occasionally drove past the shop. She didn't trust the swagger that came from certain men wearing badges. She had her reasons. The last police handler she'd worked with had been cruel, harsh, demanding obedience through fear and pain. That handler had been investigated and removed, but Dakota's memory didn't process bureaucratic justice. She remembered only the feeling of danger attached to blue uniforms, but she trusted Marcus Webb completely. That trust was absolute, unconditional, the kind of loyalty that dogs develop only once in a lifetime with a human who shows them they can be safe again. The auto shop was their cover. Webb worked maintenance cleaning equipment, running diagnostics on customer vehicles, moving through the mechanical world without drawing attention. Dakota was his service dog, his companion, the emotional support animal that civilians often brought to work without raising questions. To everyone who saw them, they were just a man and his dog trying to make an honest living in a struggling Rust Belt city. What nobody knew was that the Fourth Precinct of Riverside Police Department had become the target of a 3-year federal investigation. The investigation had started quietly. Federal informants had gone missing in Riverside City. Thousands of dollars in seized drug money had vanished from evidence lockers. Detectives investigating the disappearances found patterns of corruption in the Fourth Precinct that were too systematic to ignore. Officers with excessive force complaints that never resulted in termination. Civil rights lawsuits settled quietly by insurance companies. Arrests in specific neighborhoods that seemed to target certain demographics with brutal precision. The real moment everything accelerated was when the Department of Justice examined the arrest records from the Fourth Precinct over 5 years and found something shocking. 287 people had been arrested in those 5 years based on evidence that now appeared questionable. The charges ranged from drug possession to assault, but the common thread was undeniable. The majority were black residents of Riverside City. Many had spent months or years in jail waiting for trial. Some had accepted plea deals out of desperation, not guilt. Captain Derek Sterling ran the Fourth Precinct like it was his personal kingdom. He was 48 years old, white with a military background and a management philosophy that emphasized quotas, efficiency, and results. Sterling didn't care about methods. He cared about numbers. How many stops? How many arrests? How much revenue the precinct generated through towing contracts, vehicle impounds, and civil forfeiture. Sergeant Thomas Briggs was Sterling's enforcer. 52 years old, thick-necked, with the flat affect of someone who had learned to turn off his conscience years ago. Briggs had accumulated 5 civil rights lawsuits over his 20-year career. All of them had been settled out of court, the city paying the victims, while Briggs kept his badge and his pension. Officer Greg Miller was the rookie, 26 years old, eager to prove himself, hungry to move up the ranks, and completely willing to absorb the corruption culture that Sterling and Briggs modeled for him. Miller had a documented history of aggression, but that hadn't hindered his career. If anything, Sterling and Briggs had encouraged it. Marcus Webb's job was to get inside that world and record everything. The operation had been carefully constructed. The FBI couldn't just send an undercover agent into the Fourth Precinct. That would be too obvious, too direct. Instead, they had to create a situation where Webb would naturally come into contact with the corrupt officers. The answer was the 4th Street corridor, a neighborhood that had become a focus for Sterling's revenue generation strategy. Webb had studied the demographics. The 4th Street neighborhood was 84% black, 82% below the poverty line, and according to official police reports, a hotbed of drug activity. But when Webb looked at the actual crime statistics compiled by independent agencies, the real numbers told a different story. Drug use in the neighborhood was actually below the city average. Violent crime was significantly lower than in the wealthier white neighborhoods on the other side of town. Yet the 4th Precinct's traffic stops in that neighborhood had increased by 300% over the past 3 years. The setup was elegant in its simplicity. Webb was given a cover identity, a vehicle, and a specific daily routine that would take him through the 4th Street corridor. He would be pulled over by 4th Precinct officers conducting their standard traffic enforcement. He would be tested. They would try to find something on him, something they could use to make an arrest, generate paperwork, justify a tow truck call, and start the process of extracting revenue from the neighborhood. Everything would be recorded on the federal wire hidden beneath Webb's clothing. But there was a second insurance policy, one that Sterling and Briggs and Miller would never know about. Dakota wore a second device, a micro-transmitter woven into her collar that transmitted a constant signal back to the FBI field office. The transmitter was so small it was virtually undetectable. To anyone examining the dog, it looked like just another tag on her collar. But the signal it sent conveyed everything. The wire missed. Context, location, emotional state, movement patterns. If something went wrong, if Webb needed emergency backup, the signal from Dakota's collar could pinpoint his exact location within seconds. The partnership between Marcus Webb and Dakota was the real strength of this operation. Dogs had instincts that humans didn't. Dakota could sense when Miller and Briggs were approaching before Webb consciously registered the change in air pressure from the cruiser's engine. She could read body language in ways that no surveillance equipment could match. She was in effect Webb's early warning system wrapped in fur and loyalty. On the morning that everything would change, Webb and Dakota followed their routine. They arrived at the auto shop just before 7 in the morning. The city was still quiet, the industrial district not yet fully awake. Webb went through the motions of preparing for a workday, moving equipment around the shop, checking the Honda's maintenance logs, everything designed to look normal to maintain the cover. But as the morning progressed and the sun climbed higher in the sky, Webb felt the weight of what was about to happen. The FBI had selected this day specifically. Robert Kingsley had made the call. Today was the day Webb would be pulled over. Today was the day the trap would spring. Webb looked at Dakota, who was resting on her bed in the corner of the shop, her dark eyes tracking his movements with the kind of attention that went beyond simple canine awareness. She knew something was different about today. Dogs always know. Around 1 p.m, Webb prepared for the drive. He dressed in the worn denim and faded hoodie that had become his uniform as Arthur Pendleton. The clothes were intentionally shabby, the kind of outfit that made him invisible, made him someone who could be stopped without consequences. He ran his fingers through Dakota's fur, letting the familiar touch calm both of them. "I'm going to 4th Street today," he said quietly, speaking to her in a tone that nobody else would understand. "You're going to stay here. You're going to let them put you in the vehicle when they come. And you're going to do the most important job of your life." Dakota's ears perked at the sound of his voice. She stood and pressed against him, understanding more than words, reading the intention behind them. 287 people depended on what Webb did today. They had no idea that help was coming. They didn't know that a federal agent was about to walk into the Fourth Precinct and document the machinery of corruption that had stolen years from their lives. Webb left the auto shop at 1:28 p.m. He drove the old Honda, a 2012 model in faded blue paint, the kind of vehicle that didn't draw attention, the kind of car that blended into the working-class neighborhoods of Riverside City. He had planned the route precisely: 4th Street, then a right turn onto Hartford Avenue where the patrol car would be waiting. As he drove, he was aware of every detail. The speedometer hovered at 28 miles per hour in a 30-mile-per-hour zone. His turn signal was activated exactly 100 feet before the intersection, the legal requirement. His license tags were current. His registration was valid. Everything was perfect. Everything was by the book, and it wouldn't matter. He saw the blue lights in his rearview mirror at 1:42 p.m. The cruiser pulled smoothly behind him, the light bar illuminating the street with alternating red and blue reflections. Webb's pulse remained steady. The wire beneath his shirt was recording every sound, every vibration of the engine, every breath he took. Webb turned the Honda off Hartford Avenue and pulled smoothly to the curb. He shifted the engine into park. He turned off the ignition. He rested both hands visibly on top of the steering wheel, exactly as he'd been trained, exactly as the rule book said to do. In his side mirror, he watched 2 figures step out of the patrol cruiser. The first was Officer Greg Miller, young, broad-shouldered, with the aggressive stride of someone who believed the uniform gave him permission to dominate. The second was Sergeant Thomas Briggs, older, heavier, with the confidence of someone who'd been doing this for 2 decades and had never faced consequences. Miller swaggered to the driver's side of the Honda. He carried a tactical flashlight, the kind that police use to search vehicles at night, the kind that could blind a driver if aimed directly at the eyes. It was 1:42 p.m. The sun was at its brightest. There was no tactical reason to use the flashlight. Miller activated it anyway and shined the beam directly into Webb's eyes. "License and registration." Miller didn't offer a greeting. He didn't state the reason for the stop. He simply demanded the documents as though Webb had already been convicted of something, as though courtesy and legal procedure were luxuries that didn't apply here. Webb kept his hands on the wheel. "My wallet is in my back right pocket. My registration is in the glove compartment. How would you like me to proceed?" Miller scoffed, leaning closer to the window. "I said give me your damn license, buddy. Don't play games with me." "I'm trying to comply, officer," Webb said steadily, refusing to break eye contact even though the flashlight beam made him squint. "I just want to ensure you know where my hands are going. I'll reach for my wallet now." Webb moved slowly, pulling out a worn leather wallet that contained a perfectly forged state ID in the name Arthur Pendleton, a few crumpled dollar bills, and nothing else. His actual FBI credentials, his federal badge. The emergency contact information, everything was secured in a biometric lockbox bolted beneath the driver's seat. Only someone removing the entire seat would find it. He handed the ID through the window. Miller snatched it and held it up to the light, examining it with the kind of scrutiny that suggested he was looking for a reason to reject it. Arthur Pendleton. You're a long way from home, Arthur. What are you doing in this neighborhood? Just driving through, officer. Webb replied neutrally. May I ask why I was pulled over? Sergeant Briggs tapped his nightstick against the passenger side window. The sound was loud and sharp, a crack that reverberated through the quiet street. It was the kind of sound designed to intimidate, to establish dominance, to remind whoever was sitting in that car that they were in contact with authority. Webb merely shifted his gaze to acknowledge the sound. You swerved back there, Arthur. Briggs called out, his voice a raspy drawl. Looked like you couldn't keep it in the lines. Have you been drinking? I haven't had a drop of alcohol, Sergeant, Webb stated, and I maintained my lane the entire time. Are you calling my partner a liar? Miller snapped. His hand dropped to rest aggressively on the butt of his service weapon, a gesture that wasn't accidental. It was a message. It was a threat. It was the kind of action that sent a clear signal to Webb that the situation was about to escalate. The escalation was textbook. It was exactly what the federal analysts had warned about during the operation briefing. Miller and Briggs were creating a hostile environment, trying to provoke a reaction that would justify further action, that would create the justification for a search that would transform a traffic stop into an arrest. I'm merely stating the facts of my driving, Webb said. His tone remained deliberately flat, his pulse steady. Beneath the worn hoodie, the wire transmitted every word directly to the FBI field office where Kingsley was listening, documenting, building the case in real time. Step out of the car, Miller ordered. He took a step back and unlatched the holster of his firearm. Officer, I haven't committed a crime. Am I under arrest? Webb knew the answer to that question. He knew his rights. He also knew that asserting those rights on the side of the road with two corrupt cops was a losing game for a civilian. But Webb wasn't a civilian. He was a federal agent actively building a criminal conspiracy case. He needed Miller and Briggs to show their entire hand. He needed them to escalate to the point where their corruption became undeniable. I will step out, Webb said calmly. He raised his hands to shoulder height as he used his left hand to unbuckle his seatbelt. I am complying with your order. He opened the door slowly and stepped out onto the cracked asphalt. Before he could even straighten his posture, Miller grabbed him by the scruff of his hoodie and violently shoved him against the side of the Honda. The hot metal burned against Webb's cheek, but he offered absolutely no physical resistance. His face pressed against the car, his body completely compliant, every movement calculated to deny the officers any justification for the level of force they were applying. Spread them, Miller shouted. He kicked Webb's boots apart with unnecessary force, his knee driving up toward Webb's groin, a move that was not standard procedure, a move that was pure sadism. Officer, you do not have my consent to search my person or my vehicle, Webb stated loudly and clearly. Every word was crisp, every syllable pronounced clearly, so that the recording device picked up every detail. The words were legal protection, but they were also documentation. They were proof. Shut your mouth, Briggs growled. He came around the back of the car and grabbed Webb's left arm, twisting it behind his back at an angle that sent sharp pain radiating through Webb's shoulder. The angle was just past the point of normal restraint, just into the region of intentional infliction of pain. Stop resisting, Briggs commanded. I am not resisting, Webb replied. His voice was strained but remarkably composed. My hands are behind my back. I am complying. Miller began aggressively patting Webb down his hands, roaming roughly over his pockets. He found nothing but a set of house keys and a pack of gum. His frustration was visible, his face flushing red, his movements becoming more violent. "What are you hiding, Arthur? Where's the dope?" "I don't have anything illegal on me," Webb said. Briggs shoved Webb's face harder into the roof of the car. "We'll see about that." Miller searched the car. "Wait," Webb interjected. "You need probable cause or a warrant to search my vehicle. I am explicitly denying consent to a vehicle search." Briggs leaned in close, his breath smelling of stale coffee and chewing tobacco. "Here's the thing, Arthur. I smell marijuana coming from the cab. That gives me all the probable cause I need. Isn't that right, Miller?" "Smells like a skunk in there to me, Sarge." Miller laughed. He opened the driver's side door and began to tear through the interior with the kind of violence that suggested he was looking for something specific, not searching with any real purpose. Webb remained against the car, his face against the hot metal, his body completely still. The wire was recording everything. Every word, every admission, every violation of procedure. Every falsified claim about smelling marijuana, every unconstitutional search, every moment of abuse. Miller worked his way through the glove compartment, finding the registration insurance documents, maintenance records. He tossed them aside and reached beneath the seats, searching for anything he could use. He found nothing. The car was clean. There was nothing to find because there had never been anything to find. In frustration, Miller reached into the back seat, his hand moving toward the rear area where he might plant something, might fabricate evidence. But at that moment, something happened that neither Miller nor Briggs anticipated. Dakota had been at the auto shop when Webb drove away. She'd watched from the window as the Honda disappeared down 4th Street. The moment the wire sensed the police cruiser's presence, the signal had activated in her collar. The dog had felt the vibration, had understood the meaning, and had begun to pace in the shop. An hour later, when Webb hadn't returned, when the wire's signal indicated he was stationary, and the stress indicators were high, Dakota had started to whimper. The shop manager, a man named Peter Halloway, who was part of the undercover operation, had received the alert on his phone. The protocol was clear. If the operation went beyond 90 minutes without a check in, animal control would be called. But the protocol also included a fail-safe. The shop manager was authorized to resist handing over the dog, to claim that the dog was part of the shop's business operations, to delay long enough for the FBI to extract Webb if necessary. What neither the shop manager nor the FBI's operational team anticipated was that Dakota would make her own decision about what to do next. While Webb was being searched, while Miller was reaching toward the back seat, Dakota had begun to move. The dog had started to pace, then to bark, then to demand to be let out of the shop. The microtransmitter in Dakota's collar had been activated for 7 minutes now. The signal was reaching the FBI field office clearly. Robert Kingsley had watched the signal intensify as Webb's stress levels rose. He had heard every word of the traffic stop through the wire. He had understood immediately what was happening. At 1:55 in the afternoon, exactly 13 minutes after the traffic stop began, Kingsley made the call that would change everything. He dialed the number for the Riverside City Police Department headquarters. He asked to speak to Chief James Montgomery immediately. When Montgomery picked up the phone, Kingsley's voice was ice cold. "Chief Montgomery, this is Special Agent Robert Kingsley with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I am calling to inform you that you currently have a federal undercover agent in custody at your 4th Precinct. His name is Special Agent Marcus Webb. He was arrested approximately 15 minutes ago based on fabricated evidence." There was silence on the phone. Montgomery's voice, when he finally spoke, was barely a whisper. "What did you say?" "I said you have an FBI agent in your custody. He was conducting an undercover investigation into corruption at your 4th Precinct." Your officers have arrested him based on drug evidence that does not exist. Everything that has happened in the past 15 minutes has been recorded on federal audio equipment." Montgomery's hand began to shake. He understood immediately the scope of the disaster. He understood that Sterling and Briggs and Miller had just made the most catastrophic mistake of their careers. "Who is on that arrest?" he demanded. "Officers Miller and Briggs. Captain Sterling is likely aware by now, and I suggest you locate Agent Webb immediately and place him in an interview room with FBI personnel." Montgomery hung up and immediately contacted Sterling. The conversation was brief, violent, and filled with the kind of panic that comes from suddenly understanding that an entire precinct is about to collapse. At 2:01 in the afternoon, exactly 19 minutes after the traffic stop began, a plainclothes FBI agent entered the Fourth Precinct carrying federal warrants. He walked directly to holding cell 4, where Webb was sitting on a metal bunk, completely composed, completely aware that his extraction was beginning. The cell door opened. The agent, a woman named Sarah Chen, looked at Webb with an expression of controlled fury. "You all right?" "Fine." Webb stood immediately. "My dog, where is she?" Agent Chen's expression softened slightly. "She's safe. We picked her up from the auto shop 15 minutes ago. She's at the federal holding facility in Riverside. She's being monitored by a veterinary tech." Webb's shoulders dropped with relief. The moment his body relaxed, he felt the pain of Briggs's arm twist the burn of his face against the car, the impact of Miller's knee. The injuries would be documented, photographed, recorded. They would be evidence. "Come on," Chen said. "Let's get you out of here." The walk from the holding cell to the interrogation room took 45 seconds. In those 45 seconds, Webb saw officers looking at him with sudden awareness, with the understanding that something enormous had just shifted beneath their feet. The casual corruption that had defined the Fourth Precinct for years had just collided with federal consequence. In the interrogation room, Chief Montgomery was already present. Captain Sterling was not. Sterling had gone home, had begun calling his attorney, had started the process of defending himself against what he already knew would be catastrophic federal charges. Montgomery looked at Webb as though the man in front of him was an apparition, something that didn't make logical sense. "Agent Webb, I apologize. I don't know what my officers were thinking. I don't know how this happened." Webb looked at him with complete composure. Officer Miller and Sergeant Briggs conducted an illegal traffic stop. They fabricated evidence of drug possession. They denied me access to counsel. They violated my civil rights under color of law, and they did it all while I was wearing a federal wire. The color drained from Montgomery's face. He understood that the conversation he was having was the beginning of the end of his career, the beginning of the collapse of the Fourth Precinct, the beginning of a federal investigation that would destroy 17 officers, compromise hundreds of convictions, and cost his city millions of dollars. "I need to see your operation chief," Webb continued. "I need a damage assessment, and I need to be reunited with my K-9 partner immediately." By 3 o'clock that afternoon, Robert Kingsley had arrived at Fourth Precinct headquarters. He was accompanied by Assistant United States Attorney Margaret Hale and Federal Marshal Service personnel. They had federal warrants for the arrest of Captain Derek Sterling, Sergeant Thomas Briggs, Officer Greg Miller, and 13 other officers who had been implicated in the wire recordings of the past 13 minutes. The building went into controlled chaos. Officers who understood what was happening began making phone calls to defense attorneys. Officers who didn't understand yet watched in confusion as their colleagues were let out in handcuffs. By 3:30 in the afternoon, FBI teams had seized computer equipment from the Fourth Precinct. They had confiscated evidence lockers. They had placed the precinct itself under federal control. And at 4:08 in the afternoon, Marcus Webb walked into the federal holding facility in Riverside where Dakota was being kept. The dog had been checked by a veterinary team. She was physically unharmed, but her stress levels had been elevated for nearly 3 hours. When she saw Webb, she didn't jump or bark. She simply stood, her entire body rigid with recognition. Webb knelt and Dakota came to him, pressing her head against his chest, trembling with the kind of fear that only a dog who'd been abandoned before could truly feel. "Easy, girl," Webb whispered. "I'm here. I'm not leaving you." Dakota's trembling gradually subsided. She pressed harder against him, and Webb felt the weight of her trust, the completeness of her loyalty, the unconditional devotion of a dog who had learned to love only one human. By sunset that evening, the story had broken on every major news outlet. CNN was running the headline on continuous loop. The Washington Post was publishing the initial investigation. A corrupt police precinct in a mid-sized Rust Belt city had just collapsed under the weight of federal evidence gathered in less than 6 hours by an undercover FBI agent and his K-9 partner. The story of what happened next would take months to unfold. The federal investigation would expand exponentially. Court documents would reveal the depth and systematic nature of the corruption. Victims who had spent years in prison based on fabricated evidence would begin the process of getting their convictions overturned. 287 people had their lives disrupted by the Fourth Precinct. Some had served prison time. Some had lost jobs, custody of children, homes, dignity. Some had lost everything. And now, because of Marcus Webb and Dakota, because of 6 hours of federal recording, the machinery of corruption was being dismantled. 3 weeks later, federal prosecutors had completed the preliminary investigations. They charged 17 officers with federal crimes. Captain Derek Sterling faced RICO conspiracy charges, civil rights violations, and wire fraud. Sergeant Thomas Briggs faced assault under color of law, fabrication of evidence, and violation of civil rights. Officer Greg Miller faced falsification of official records and conspiracy. The charges carried potential sentences of 20 years or more, but the real reckoning was still to come. 6 months after the initial arrest, the federal courthouse in Riverside was filled with tension. The trial of the Fourth Precinct corruption case had drawn national attention. Media vans filled the parking lot. Legal scholars were analyzing the case as one of the most comprehensive corruption prosecutions in a decade. Marcus Webb sat in the front row of the gallery, dressed in a sharp navy suit, completely transformed from the faded hoodie mechanic of Arthur Pendleton. Beside him sat Dakota, wearing a federal service vest that identified her as an official K-9 officer. The dog was calm, poised, her dark eyes scanning the courtroom with the kind of awareness that suggested she understood the importance of the moment. United States District Judge Patricia Morrison looked down at the defendants from the bench. Capital Sterling Sergeant Briggs and Officer Miller sat in orange jumpsuits, shackled at the wrists and ankles. The arrogance that had defined them, the confidence that they were untouchable, had been stripped away, replaced by the hollow, terrified stares of men who understood they were about to lose their freedom. Judge Morrison was a woman in her 60s, with silver hair, steel gray eyes, and a reputation for zero tolerance for police corruption and abuse of power. She had presided over the trial with meticulous attention to detail. The evidence was overwhelming. The audio recordings of the traffic stop were unrefutable. The testimonies from federal agents, from Webb himself, from victims whose convictions would be overturned, had painted a picture of corruption that extended far beyond the initial charges. The evidence presented in this court is the most damning display of corruption under the color of law I have seen in my entire career. Judge Morrison's voice echoed through the silent courtroom. You did not protect and serve. You operated as a criminal enterprise using badges as your uniforms, and the law as your weapon. You targeted the vulnerable. You falsified documents to destroy lives, and you believed your authority made you invincible. She turned her gaze directly to Sterling. Richard Sterling, for your role in directing this criminal enterprise under the RICO Act, and for conspiring to deprive citizens of their civil rights, I sentence you to 22 years in federal prison without the possibility of early parole. Sterling squeezed his eyes shut. His legs began to tremble so violently that a U.S. Marshal had to step forward to steady him. Sterling had been confident, arrogant, certain that his position would protect him. The sentence shattered that illusion completely. Thomas Briggs, for assault under the color of law, fabrication of evidence, and kidnapping, I sentence you to 15 years in federal prison. Briggs hung his head. A tear escaped his eye, the single visible sign of the catastrophic collapse of his life. The 20-year veteran, the untouchable street boss who had ruled the Fourth Precinct through fear and corruption, was going to spend the next 15 years locked in a federal penitentiary. He had no wife to support him anymore. His children had disowned him. His pension was forfeit. Greg Miller, for your participation in this criminal conspiracy and falsification of official records, I sentence you to 6 years in federal prison. Miller openly sobbed. The young officer's arrogance, his swagger, his confidence that he was protected by the uniform and the system was completely shattered. He would spend the next 6 years in prison. The trajectory of his entire life had been redirected by the choices he made in 13 minutes, but the convictions were only half of the reckoning. The financial destruction was about to begin. The city of Riverside had been forced to retain expensive federal counsel. The city's insurance provider had reviewed the corruption charges and made a determination that shocked the city government. The insurance company invoked what was called an intentional acts exclusion. The insurance would not cover any liability for criminal conduct. If the police department had committed crimes, if the city had knowingly allowed corruption, then that was not a covered peril. Riverside would have to pay out of its own general fund. The Department of Justice, in coordination with the city government, finalized a massive consent decree. The decree mandated that the city establish a victim compensation fund for everyone who had been wrongfully arrested, wrongfully convicted, or wrongfully detained by the Fourth Precinct. There were 287 people in that category. The federal government calculated the damages. Wrongful imprisonment settlements averaged $35,000 per victim. The calculation was straightforward. 287 multiplied by $35,000 equaled $10,045,000. Add the federal civil rights violation penalty, add the consent decree compliance costs, and the total reckoning reached $9.5 million. $9.5 million that the city had to pay from its general fund. Mayor Patricia Hendricks resigned in disgrace before the consent decree was finalized. She issued a brief statement through her attorney, took a generous severance package, and disappeared from public life. Police Chief James Montgomery was fired. His pension was under investigation. His credentials were stripped. His legacy, whatever it might have been, was permanently cemented as the chief who allowed corruption to flourish. And all 17 convicted officers forfeited their pensions. The money was seized and redirected into the Victim Compensation Fund. Men who had spent their entire careers believing they would retire comfortably on the taxpayer's dime, who had built their retirement plans around the idea that their pension was untouchable, discovered that their futures had been erased. The pensions of Sterling Briggs Miller and 14 others, totaling approximately $3.2 million, were liquidated and paid into the victim fund. The city had to liquidate assets to cover the remaining balance. The armored vehicles that Chief Montgomery had purchased, the specialized equipment, the tools of oppression that had been purchased with municipal funds were sold at auction. The money went into the victim fund. By the time the settlement was finalized, $9.5 million had been distributed to victims. Each of the 287 people who had been wrongfully affected received approximately $33,000. It wasn't justice in the complete sense. Justice would have required them to recover the years they lost, the relationships that were destroyed, the careers that were derailed, the mental health damage that would take years to process. Money couldn't reverse trauma. Money couldn't restore time. But money acknowledged the wrong. Money represented an institutional admission that the system had failed them, that the police had betrayed their trust, that the city had allowed corruption to flourish. And for many of the victims, that acknowledgement was the first time anyone in power had ever admitted fault. 3 weeks before the victim compensation began, Marcus Webb and Dakota walked out of the federal courthouse in Riverside into the afternoon sun. The courtroom had been filled with media. Cameras flashed as Webb descended the stone steps with Dakota at his side. Robert Kingsley walked beside him, shaking his head in disbelief. $9.5 million, Kingsley muttered. This city is going to feel that for a decade. They're feeling the cure, boss, Webb said softly, looking out at the Riverside City streets. The disease was costing them a lot more than money. It was costing them their humanity. Kingsley nodded. He understood what Webb meant. The Fourth Precinct had not simply been a place where corruption happened. It had been a place where the social fabric of an entire community had been torn, where people had learned not to trust the institutions that were supposed to protect them, where young people had grown up believing that the law was a weapon pointed at them, not a shield meant to protect them. The $9.5 million would help. The convictions of Sterling, Briggs, Miller, and the others would provide some measure of justice. But the real healing would take years, maybe generations. Where to next? Sam Kingsley asked. Webb adjusted his jacket. I hear the Miami office needs a K-9 unit supervisor. Someone good with engines, someone even better at taking out the trash. He reached down and ran his fingers across Dakota's head. The dog pressed against his leg, and together they walked away from the federal courthouse, away from Riverside, away from the corruption that they had exposed and dismantled. Webb blended into the bustling street crowd, a silent guardian who had stepped into the belly of the beast and ripped it out from the inside. Dakota walked beside him, her posture confident, her trust complete, her loyalty absolute. The Fourth Precinct building was an empty, boarded-up brick shell within 6 months. It stood as a monument to the day 17 badges thought they were above the law, and the day one man and his dog proved them dead wrong. True justice rarely arrives with a warning. It often comes disguised as the very prey the wicked seek to devour. The collapse of the Fourth Precinct stood as a profound testament to the ultimate price of unchecked authority and corruption. 17 officers lost their badges, their freedom, and their futures because they forgot the fundamental truth of their oath. Power is a privilege granted by the people, not a weapon to be wielded against them. The $9.5 million financial ruin that struck the city wasn't just a penalty. It was a mandatory restitution, a painful but necessary extraction of the corruption that had infected the local government. Marcus Webb's silent endurance exposed the darkest corners of a broken system, proving that no badge is an impenetrable shield. Eventually, the weight of real-life karma will always collect its debts. 3 months after the convictions were finalized, Webb was reassigned to the Miami field office. He and Dakota moved into a new apartment in the Wynwood neighborhood, a place where dogs were welcome, where Webb could build a new life. But his real focus became clear very quickly. Webb's experience with Dakota, his understanding of how a dog could sense danger before humans could detect it, his recognition that trauma in dogs mirrored trauma in humans, led him to propose a new federal program. The Dakota Recovery Initiative, as it became known, was designed to identify rescue dogs who had experienced abuse or trauma in law enforcement settings and retrain them to work as federal service animals. The program would take dogs like Dakota dogs who had been broken by the system and transform them into tools of accountability, into living reminders that the system could be reformed, could be made to protect instead of harm. 6 months into the program, Webb had identified and begun training 12 dogs. Each of them had a story similar to Dakota's. Each of them had been damaged by cruel handlers, traumatized by the very institution they were supposed to serve. Each of them, given the right handler, given the right environment, given the right purpose, had the potential to protect a sensed danger, to remind the system that consequences were real. 1 year after Webb's transfer to Miami, Dakota was awarded a federal commendation for her service during the Fourth Precinct investigation. The commendation recognized that the dog had played an essential role in the gathering of evidence that her protective instinct during the vehicle search had preserved crucial evidence that her presence had provided Webb with the psychological strength to endure 6 hours in custody without compromise. At the commendation ceremony held in the Miami field office, Dakota sat beside Webb, wearing her official Federal Service vest, her eyes calm and focused her trust in her handler, Absolute. The chief of the Miami field office stood before the assembled agents. Special Agent Marcus Webb and his K-9 partner Dakota have demonstrated extraordinary courage and dedication in the service of justice. Dakota's loyalty, her instinct, her unwavering devotion to her handler exemplifies the qualities we seek to cultivate in law enforcement. But more than that, Dakota's story reminds us that even those who have been broken by the system can be repaired, can be restored, can become instruments of accountability and reform. The commendation was presented. Dakota received a special collar, a federal designation that would follow her for the rest of her life. But the real tribute came weeks later, when the first victims of the Fourth Precinct corruption case received their compensation payments. A woman named Teresa Jackson, who had spent 18 months in county jail for a crime she didn't commit, used her compensation to restart her life. She opened a small business, a community center for young people. A place where kids could learn that institutions could change, that accountability was possible. Another victim, a man named David Lopez, who had lost custody of his children while serving a prison sentence for fabricated drug charges, used his compensation to fight for custody restoration and to become an advocate for criminal justice reform. 285 others found their own ways to use the money to rebuild their lives, to find meaning in the fact that someone finally had held the system accountable. The Fourth Precinct became a symbol not of corruption, but of the possibility of reform. The boarded-up building was eventually demolished. In its place, the city of Riverside built a community center, a space dedicated to dialogue between law enforcement and the communities they served, a place where the conversation about trust and accountability could continue. And in Miami, Marcus Webb continued his work with the Dakota Recovery Initiative. He trained dog after dog, handler after handler, building a network of federal K-9 teams that embodied the lesson he and Dakota had learned together. That loyalty, that trust, that willingness to see the best in someone. Even when they've been broken by the system, those qualities were worth protecting. Those qualities were worth fighting for. Those qualities were the foundation upon which true reform could be built. Webb often thought back to that morning when he and Dakota had begun their surveillance work in Riverside. He thought about the decision to let Dakota sense danger, to trust her instinct to build a partnership based on mutual respect and trust. That partnership had dismantled a corrupt precinct, had exposed 17 officers, had recovered $9.5 million for victims had changed the trajectory of an entire community. All because one dog had learned to trust again and one handler had learned to listen. The lessons of Riverside City spread. Other federal agencies began examining their own operations, looking for the kind of corruption that had been hidden in plain sight for years. Police departments across the country started implementing the kinds of reforms that Riverside had been forced to adopt. Civilian review boards became more common. Body camera requirements became more stringent. The conversation about police accountability, which had been dominated by arguments about culture and politics, became grounded in specific reforms, specific consequences, specific results. The Dakota Recovery Initiative became a model for other federal agencies. By the second year, there were 78 dogs in active training. By the fifth year, there were more than 200 dogs who had been rescued, retrained, and deployed as federal service animals. But it all started with one dog who refused to abandon her handler. One handler who understood that loyalty was a two-way street, and one moment when the system, for the first time in years, was held completely accountable for its actions. Years later, when Webb was interviewed about his role in the Fourth Precinct investigation, he always began with the same statement. "I didn't expose that corruption alone. Dakota was every bit as much a part of that investigation as I was. She sensed the danger. She protected the evidence. She reminded me that even in the darkest moments, there was a reason to keep fighting." When asked about the final outcome, Webb always emphasized the same point. The $9.5 million was important. The convictions of Sterling and Briggs and Miller and the others were important. The closure of the Fourth Precinct was important. But the most important outcome was the recognition that the system could change, that institutions could be reformed, that accountability was possible, that the people who had been damaged by the system could be restored and could move forward with their lives. That was the real victory, not punishment, but restoration. Not just holding the guilty accountable, but giving the innocent a second chance. If this story has resonated with you, if the courage of an undercover agent and his loyal companion has moved you in any way, we would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever witnessed an institution admit fault? Have you ever seen a system transform itself? Have you ever experienced the kind of loyalty that only a dog can offer? Drop your thoughts below and let us know how this story landed for you. Thank you so much for watching and for allowing us to share this story with you. If you enjoyed this account of justice served, of corruption exposed, and of the unbreakable bond between a handler and his K9 partner, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. We'll be back next week with another story of loyalty, courage, and the power of accountability. Thanks for being here.